We'll get started this afternoon with our first keynote speaker. Abigail Hendershot, a 30-year veteran of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE, is the Executive Director of the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, or MPART. MPART is a multi-agency task force charged with investigating PFAS contamination, overseeing cleanup and other response activities aimed at protecting Michigan's drinking water. Abby has focused on PFAS response activities since 2017 and led the team responsible for Michigan's largest PFAS contamination response to date, the investigation into the former Wolverine Worldwide Tannery in Rockford. In that role, her team was responsible for a $113 million legal settlement establishing cleanup plans and municipal water connections for thousands of residents in northern Kent County. Abby supervised the Remediation and Redevelopment Division's Grand Rapids District Office and has more than 25 years of project management experience for complex environmental remediation projects. So Abby, welcome to the conference and the floor is yours.
There we go. Thank you, Elizabeth. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to talk with you today. Let me bring up my slides and share my screen. So there we go. All right. So hopefully you're seeing the slides. Correct, Elizabeth?
Yes, just need presentation mode.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's great.
Presentation mode. Okay, we did it. Conquering Technologies, part one of every good presentation, right? So thank you again for inviting me to speak with you about PFAS, about collaboration. As Elizabeth said, I am Abby Hendershot. I'm the Executive Director for what we call the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, MPART in Michigan, and I'm very happy to be with you today. So what I've been asked to talk about is the holistic approach that MPART uses for PFAS collaboration, and why it's so important to have collaboration, coordination among the different 7 different state agencies in the state. So we'll talk about, we'll touch on what PFAS is. I'm assuming everybody knows, but we'll go real quick. The complexity of the PFAS cycle, why this has been a more challenging, I would say a more challenging contaminant class than some of the other ones that we've dealt with in the last 30 years. And then examples of the collaboration that we've been able to do in Michigan and how it's really been able to leverage and advance us out into the front of the pack for some of the PFAS research. Then I'm going to give you some of the stuff of what Michigan has learned along the way. Some of the tips that we have learned from hard-won experiences. And so I think you'll find something to hopefully glean out of this presentation. So let's go through real quick. Everybody here, I would think, has got a pretty good handle on what per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are. We all know about their strong carbon fluorine bonds. We all know what they're used for. I would say this slide probably needs to be updated from 5,000 to 10,000 different compounds, but we are probably all here because they are widespread through our ecosystem. We know that the toxicity is a big factor. We know that they bioaccumulate. Probably a lot of your talks are about bioaccumulation, about how it gets into our wildlife and our environment, as well as treatment technologies. And so we know that there's health effects. We are here because of the emerging science, the information that is rapidly developing around PFAS. So that's great to see in the last 5 years, but we're still lacking those federal standards. That is still something that is desperately needed, I think, to advance PFAS. I show this slide, usually use it just to talk and as a general education piece, but I think it really, again, highlights how PFAS is different than other contaminants that we've dealt with from the environmental industry, because usually we're not worried about things that come out of potentially coming out of people's septic tanks or potentially coming out of their homes or our homes as everyday uses. And so PFAS is really, really quite more complex and challenging, which is part of the reason I'm here to talk to you today about collaboration. So this is a Eagle diagram that we've put together, and I think it's actually being used today for this conference. So happy to share it. And but I think it really shows the complexity of the PFAS cycle. There are so many different ways that PFAS can get out into the environment, so many different ways that it can cycle through our environment, cycle through our mechanical processes, through our rivers and our groundwater, and potentially get into drinking water. And so there's so many different ways that we can work together to try to break those cycles, but they all take collaboration, they all take coordination. And it's just a really challenging situation that we've had, you know, maybe bits and pieces with other contaminants. I'm thinking of TCE and PCE, but we haven't, in a little bit PCBs, but we haven't really dealt with this type of, you know, statewide issues since probably mercury. And so I think this is pretty unique, and it really has challenged us as researchers, as scientists, as environmentalists, and regulatory agencies to really get our hands wrapped around how do we effectively coordinate on PFAS. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me tell you a little bit about what MPART is and why it's so unique in the world of PFAS. So MPART is an agency, a team created specifically in 2017 by Governor Snyder as a executive directive to kind of create like a task force at that point. It's now an enduring body under Executive Order 2019 with Governor Whitmer, and is really designed specifically to coordinate 7 different state agencies that all have roles with PFAS issues, as to give us a strategic implementation and coordination of all things PFAS. And this has really led to broad-based cooperation and coordination among all levels of our government. As we coordinate on these things, we're speaking with one voice. We're being able to talk directly to the governor's office and down to our lower local units of government, as well as up at the national level. So it's really been really quite effective for us to leverage that unified voice. So let me show you a picture of our coordination structure. Now, this is going to look kind of messy, and you may not be able to read everything on here, but 7 different agencies: our Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, where I'm housed, our Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Department of Natural Resources, of course, Department of Transportation, they do all of our airports, Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs is where our fire marshal is housed, and then our Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, which has all of our military bases, military installations and such, that again are an often source of PFAS. As the executive director, I coordinate with all of those 7 different agencies, as well as the governor's office, and then with some of our work groups, as well as down to the technical level with all of our we've got, 18 to 20 different topical work groups on a wide variety of issues, where we get together technical experts from all of these different departments to sit at the table and brainstorm ideas and thoughts. So let me show you how it really is a little bit easier to vision. So this is more, I think, a better visualization of that coordination of roles among the agencies. As I said, all of these agencies have regulatory roles. They all have laws, rules, policies, or responsibilities that require they interact with PFAS and they address PFAS in some way. But it's so important to make sure that one agency's policies aren't going to overlap or conflict with another agency's policies. And so that is where MPART comes in. We're constantly at the table talking about PFAS. These 7 different agencies all have PFAS technical experts who in some cases are learning on the job as they go, but are all there to bring their particular point of view to the table and be able to talk. Some of the other thing I will say is in addition to the 7 different agencies, we often are bringing in local public health. We can't do the public health response, which of course protection of public health is our number one responsibility and priority, but that is something that can't be done without the local public health officers at the table being able a part of that conversation, because implementation of those public health protective measures are so important. And so we often are bringing in for specific projects, the local health department as well, to make sure that we've got everybody coordinated on what happens. So some of the things that we've done in this coordination role, we'll go through a couple examples here, but is looking at the studying the occurrence of PFAS in our state, getting a baseline of what has PFAS in it, identifying those types of sources. We've been pretty successful in identifying the sources of PFAS, studying the fate and transport to the extent that we have the research and the data, studying the ecological effects, again, additional study and data is needed, and then evaluating toxicology, educating our citizens, and looking at ways that we can minimize future use of PFAS and even prevention. How do we work together to get to those final goals as well? So the thing with PFAS, I think that is so much different than some of our other contaminants is that it is truly an emerging science. Not that PFAS is new, but we have science that is not fully developed. As you guys all well know, there's so much more research to be done around PFAS, specifically on some of our other not PFOS or not PFOA, but the other newly formed PFAS compounds. If you go to 5,000 to 10,000 different compounds, depending on how you define what a PFAS molecule is, there's so many different uses, and I think there's just so many different ways that we don't understand how they behave in the environment, nor do we have the toxicological information to make true public health assessments on those chemicals. And so the science is still there. We're going to continue to work our way around. I like to think of this as almost a wheel, because as the science comes out, we see the research, we start hearing about it in public outcry, public education is there, we start developing policies, we start trying to be transparent about what the information we have, but then ultimately it's got to end up in some sort of regulatory framework so that we can continue to make sure that the public health is protected. So I think of it as a wheel, but it really needs to be holistic. And so let me give you an example of one of those. One of the things that we have done at the state is when we first started MPART, you'll see on this timeline that it was late in 2017 before MPART was even established. Before that time, we had some surface water quality standards. We were using EPA's lifetime health advisory, but really, for drinking water, none of it was regulatorily enforceable. We didn't have anything to compel a liable party to do cleanup, and we were really struggling back then. So as part of MPART, one of the first things we were able to do is actually set some criteria for PFOS and PFOA based on the EPA's lifetime health advisory. So we matched it at 70 parts per trillion, and then started working on what would be good maximum contaminant levels. What does it look like to have good sound science? And so we asked specifically to have a science advisory board. You'll see down here in April of 2019, we asked the science advisory board to actually, which was made up of academic researchers, so non-state people, to actually come look through the research, look through the data, the toxicological information, and give us their best science, best advice for what were the PFAS chemicals that had enough data to set maximum contaminant levels, and then what would those health-based standards be. And so we started doing that in April, and they came back with their report in June. But along the way, we are working, we're really in the point of guiding MPART without there was no blueprint for what we were doing. There was no way to build on other people's work. We were really trying to do this and make this up and be strategic as we went through. So even as that whole science advisory work is going on, we're out and doing public survey of all of our public water systems in the state, 2,700 water systems in the state, using the 70 parts per trillion that we had then for groundwater cleanup criteria. And again, that was not an enforceable standard, but that was something we had to use as a guideline, using the 70 parts per trillion for the lifetime health advisory. So again, it was a very collaborative effort, not without a few hiccups along the way, but really because we had all the agencies at the table, it was truly, and it was a monumental task. And I will say that for Michigan, this was a little bit scary, not knowing what we were going to find for concentrations, not knowing how it was going to turn out. It turned out to be one of our, definitely one of our best works, because we were able to establish that baseline for the state as to what we knew, where we knew we had problems. In the end, we had just 2 public water supplies that were above our 70 parts per trillion that were immediately put on bottled water and rerouted for making sure that the PFAS was taken out of that water supply. But we did all the schools, we did all the daycares, we did all of our tribal public water supplies too. So that is collaboration. The other thing I'll mention is that within our Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, again, we've got many different divisions working on a whole lot of regulatory framework or regulatory statutes that require a piece or part of that effort. So while the Drinking Water Environmental Health Division had the bulk of the work in setting the maximum contaminant levels, and I will say that this was the first time in our state's history that we had ever set maximum contaminant levels under the Safe Drinking Water Act outside of EPA's normal MCL process. So we'd never gone through this process ourselves, but we thought it was really important as a state agency or as a state department to have MCLs, because protection of public health was so important. And so we leveraged the work of all of the divisions, we leveraged the work of all of the departments to push forward and have a successful promulgation of MCLs. So at this point, we do have now Michigan's drinking water standards, both as maximum contaminant levels under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is applicable to all of our 2,700 drinking water supplies that are regulated under Safe Drinking Water Act. But also we have the same 7 contaminants that have set groundwater cleanup criteria protective of drinking water under our state cleanup regulations. And so we have dual coverage, both for the public water supplies as well as for groundwater cleanup. And so that's been really successful and helpful for getting Michigan going in the right direction and identifying all of those occurrences and making sure our public is protected. So that's one example of the collaboration that we've been able to do. Another example is under talking about fish and wildlife consumption. We've for years had an Eat Safe Fish program, but we've also been going out and sampling of deer, other wildlife. And so again, it's that collaborative structure. MPART helps to make sure all the coordination and collaboration is there, but every agency has their own set of goals and is seated at the table to talk about them. And so DNR obviously has a big role when you're talking about fish and wildlife. Eagle does all of our fish sampling. They do caged fish studies based on those areas where we know there's contamination. So we look at the contamination occurrences and then go with doing those caged fish studies. MDARD, of course, has a role as commercially sold or raised fish, any of those kind of commercial products. And then Department of Health and Human Services has the responsibility of actually looking at all the data and then setting those consumption advisories, setting the advisories for people who might be fishing out in our states, or if there's particular areas. We did have one deer in the state that was especially high, and so we set a 3-mile zone around that area and just told people not to eat the deer in that 3 miles. And so that's been successful as well. But this again is one of those examples of that collaboration that needs to happen. Actually, we will have our Eat Safe Fish Guide coming out probably next week. Along with those, besides just making sure the coordination's there, that collaboration is also important to making sure that we are being consistent with our federal partners, making sure that we're being consistent with what EPA is doing, consistent with ATSDR, the best available toxicology and epidemiology information that we have with the fish and the wildlife and the ecology research going on. There's so much information, as you guys well know, that it's changing so fast that it really takes all of the state agencies as well as checking in with our federal partners to keep on top of it. And so again, having 10 minds at the table can be really, really helpful in making sure we're not missing anything. So we've been able to really leverage that collaborative nature just for this program. Some of the examples of what this looks like for the state is, at least for Michigan, we've taken the toxicology information for PFOS, we've plugged it into what would be a safe level, an acceptable level of risk for consumption, and plugged it into what it would look like on a meals per month basis based on concentration. So, anything over 300 parts per billion is going to get a do not eat advisory. And we're evaluating this again to make sure that the data we have for the toxicology hasn't changed, for PFOS hasn't changed drastically. So we're currently in the process of evaluating that. This is an example of our Eat Safe Fish Guide. It's pretty easy for people to look at and understand, which I like. I think it should be pretty self-explanatory for a fisherman to be able to look at this and say, yep, this is what the fish is, this is how many I should be eating, and maybe I'll throw this one back. Some of the consumption advisories, we are adding fish and water bodies as we Eagle continues to do sampling of surface water and of fish. Different water bodies will get added. But remember, these consumption guidelines take into the big picture. They don't just look at PFOS, they look at all of the contaminants that are being found in fish, including your metals, your mercury, your PCBs, your PFAS, and any other contaminants that we are concerned with in particular water bodies. So that again just takes that coordination to make sure we're not missing a crucial piece of that puzzle in trying to cover and protect for public health. In messaging, I think making sure your messaging is very clear about what you're doing. Some of the other things that we have been working on as a collaborative effort we've been looking at doing assessments of our platers, really looking at source reduction as a strategy for the state. We know that airports are a big, airports, because of their use of AFFF, have been a big contributor to groundwater and surface water contamination. Pretty much all of the airports have surface water and groundwater contamination. We're still in varying stages of investigation, but out of the 19 airports that we gave grant money to for doing investigation, they all found contamination. Our wastewater treatment plants, again, as you can see from the little diagram, that is the receivers of contamination. Wastewater treatment plants are not a great way to address PFAS contamination. So the much more effective and strategic place is to make sure that your sources, your PFAS industries, are controlling those discharges and keeping it at their facilities, so the wastewater treatment plants don't have to treat it, and so it doesn't get out into our biosolids and or water, or discharges through NPS, that kind of thing. Landfills, we've done a strategic evaluation of all the landfills in the state, prioritize them based on what we knew about the landfills, their potential risk to adjacent receptors, if there were drinking water wells close by, if there was shallow groundwater flow direction, all of that, and have prioritize them into 3 different tiers. The tier 1 landfills have all been assessed for PFAS so far in the state, and we're working our way through the tier 2 lower priority landfills now. Military bases, of course, I shouldn't have to say too much about, but they are all being assessed for PFAS in the state as well. Our tanneries, and soon we've got about 20 to 25 fire training centers in our state that have not been looked at yet, but they are on our list of additional locations to evaluate for PFAS and the potential risk. So some of the stuff that I see coming in the future for PFAS is, we've been focused very much on a state, local level for PFAS, understanding the occurrence, understanding the industries, understanding what our specific issues are. Now I think we've got a pretty good handle on those issues in Michigan, and I think we're really now bracing for what does it mean to try to take our Michigan processes and our Michigan standards and meld them into what we see coming forward. The EPA PFAS strategic roadmap laid out a lot of very aggressive and much needed federal regulatory processes for PFAS. So I'm very excited about that. But how do we make sure that what we've got going on in Michigan already is set up to be able to meld in and mimic what EPA is going for? I think we are in pretty good shape. There's a few areas that we're going to have to do some more collaboration about, but I think we're in pretty good shape. But this is a big one. I think our future PFAS collaboration is going to be more at the national level. We need to have a better roadmap for where we're going with food safety, where we're going with what does it mean for our interstate crops. Crop uptake is going to be a huge issue, and we know that EPA is working on biosolids and a risk assessment for biosolids, which is going to be much needed and hugely important to, I think, the way that we, as all of our states, address PFAS from a regulatory standpoint. So I think we're going to need to go around this circle a few more times to be able to make sure that we've got not only the science and the research marrying up, but also then those regulatory processes that might be at the federal level, that they're going to match what we've got at the state level as well. So some of the things that we have learned, I think the first one is, you hear a lot about different task force and different groups getting together to talk about PFAS, but unless there's really somebody in charge, unless there's really somebody that's given established priority and established authority for PFAS and for the leadership of the group, I think that's probably the number one key is It's great to get a whole bunch of people at the table, but who's in charge and who's going to actually take ownership of the process? And so having MPART and having my position as an executive director established has been probably the most important thing, is having that leadership role of saying, no, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to have all of our state departments moving in this direction. Obviously, I have really made it our foundation to be data-driven, to be science-based, to make sure we understand our approach, make sure that we gather as much information about our state occurrence of PFAS across our state so that we can develop those strategic approaches. All of those approaches, of course, are going to make sure that we put the number one priority on public health. That's always been our approach, but sometimes, implementing those strategic approaches when you don't really have the blueprint and you don't have a guidebook on how to do it, gets a little difficult. So just know that you're going to have to be strategic. You're going to have to be adaptable. You're going to have to learn along the way. And you're probably going to have to start small and expand. So for the first year, we spent just doing public drinking water supplies. We laid out letters for all of those supplies. We basically wrote the letter that they would send to their constituents. We came up with a tiered approach as to the results. If they were in from this concentration to this concentration, this is what would happen. This is the letter they would send. And we paid for all the sampling. We paid for that public water supply sampling so that it didn't fall onto the supplies to do it. And that was very, very successful, and really gave confidence to the state public water supply for not only the supplies themselves, but for the rest of us. So we started small. So then the next year we expanded out and did a larger public water supply systems. We did all our type 2 wells, our transient wells, and campground wells, and all those things. So it's been, we started small and expanded, and we got to know our landscape as we went. The other thing that I would say was one of our biggest lessons learned is, if you are going to collect data, have a plan, have a strategy for why you're going to collect that data. Don't just collect data. Know what you're going to collect, why you're going to collect it, and how you're going to collect it. Develop yourself a quality assurance plan and a communication plan. If you collect the data and you don't have a way to how you're going to explain the data, don't bother collecting it. As an example, we had in the early days, we were out collecting a lot of groundwater samples from various places to understand, potential contamination in people's wells. But what if you collect a groundwater sample from a farm, and suddenly it indicates that you've got a huge problem with that farm well that they're using to water all of their dairy herd. We know that's a situation that happened down in New Mexico, could easily happen just about anywhere. And not that you shouldn't sample the well, but know what happens if you do sample the well and you do get bad results. What does it mean for the farm, and what kind of contingency plans do you have? Have to have those things in place before you start, because if you don't work through those details, you're always going to be unprepared for the bumps in the roads along the way. That kind of brainstorming really does build trust among your agencies. It builds trust with your regulated communities that you know what you're doing and you got a plan. It also gives you that kind of structure that helps you protect your citizens. It helps you address those emerging issues and lays out those plans so that you can quickly adapt to those unforeseen situations as well as the ones you can see coming down the road. One of the things that I see coming down the road in the future is our biosolids. And I think this will be an issue for a lot of our states. Michigan, it's not going to be a huge issue because we've taken some pretty proactive and aggressive measures to sample all of our wastewater treatment plants have already been sampled. All of our biosolids have already been sampled, and our sources have been reduced. So we know we've got a handle on our biosolids. We know that our biosolids right now are averaging about 14 parts per billion for the state. And so we've got a good handle on that. But if you haven't done that that broad basis of foundational work of source reduction and understanding what's coming out of your wastewater treatment plants, biosolids is going to be a really big issue. And so those are the kinds of things that I think as states we have to continue to work on. The last slide for you is, because I think Elizabeth, I'm almost out of time, is the, we've got our PFAS geographic information system. So this is a screenshot, but on our MPART website, we have an interactive GIS map that shows all of Michigan's PFAS sites, MPART sites, so 208 of them. That's not because Michigan is more contaminated than the rest of the country, just means that we've looked. And in all of those cases, not only have we found groundwater contamination above a criteria, but it's also a source. So we didn't want to just put every single point on the map where we hit groundwater contamination above a drinking water standard, above groundwater standard, but we want to make sure it's a source of PFAS as well. And so you'll see they are our military sites, our airports, our landfills, our platers, our tanneries, our AFFF spills or responses. We have a lot of things on there, but they're pretty predictable at this point. The green squares are all of our surface water samples. This number is probably higher than this. We probably got to refresh this layer, but we've got over 2,000 different water sample surface water samples in the state. You can click on any of those green squares and get the exact location and the concentration data, analytical data for each location. And then our state drinking water sampling that I was talking about, all of that data is here as well. They're in these little blue hexabins. You can, again, click on any of the systems that are listed and get their drinking water, the dates that they sampled and the drinking water sampling that we did through 2018, 2019. So it gives you a really good understanding. The thing I like about this is, again, with being not only collaborative at the state level, but this is the way to be collaborative with our stakeholders who are citizens. These are the people we are protecting. And it's really important that they be able to look in their backyard and be able to say, okay, I know what's going on. I know that where they've looked and I know where the PFAS is in my area so that I can be better informed and better protected. So I'll close and leave it for questions. Here is our MPART website link. So pretty easy to navigate. We just got a new website, but everything is out there and is working. So here's my contact information. If anybody's got questions, I think we've got time for questions, right, Elizabeth?
Yep, we have about 8 minutes for questions. Reminder to type those in the Q&A button on Zoom. And Lee, do you want to?
The first question is, does your GIS map also include historic data?
It does not include it'll include our surface water some of our historic PFAS sampling for surface water, but the triangles would be site write-ups for each of the sites. So we have not been able to connect, all of the data in that particular things, but these are layers of data that we have out there.
Oh, yep, there's another one came in.
You mentioned crop uptake of PFAS. Is there systematic sampling of food crops from fields?
No, we've done a few fields in cases where we had some concerns about potential crop uptake. We have one particular farm in the southeast Michigan area that did have some crop sampling that we did based on some pretty high concentrations of biosolids that were applied historically, leading to some pretty high soil concentrations. So, and from the crop uptake, we were able to then step and sample the actual cows. It was a beef cattle farm and sampled those cows, and we did find PFOS in the cows as well. So we're working with those farms with that farm right now to work on getting his cattle on clean feed, and it was clean water. They did have clean water, surprisingly, but the just the amount of soil that they were eating when they were grazing, and because they were pasture raised, and the contaminated crops, because the farmer not only, had contaminated fields, but he raised his own crops for his own cows. And so they were, unfortunately, it was part of that PFAS cycle that I talked about earlier, is that you end up with, that cycling of PFOS, especially. PFOS was the only thing we found in the animals. We did find a few other things, minor levels of other PFAS in the crops, but PFOS was the only thing we found in the animals.
Are you doing any human biomonitoring?
Yes, Michigan has quite a few different studies going on. We're part of a national multi-state PFAS study. We have a really high, actually, I can probably go to our website and show you if you don't mind. We have a pretty high, hold on, site in West Michigan that has, just a second, let me get to my right website, that has PFAS concentrations. And so that particular site is one where those, we had over 1,000 residents that were impacted with really, really high concentrations of PFAS. And so in that case, those people have been enrolled in the Michigan PFAS exposure study, as well as in the national 7-state PFAS study. We're also doing surveillance monitoring for our firefighters, and doing a PFAS exposure and antibody response for the COVID. And so there's a number of different things going on, but our sites of interest, and here I'll talk, here's our PFAS geographic information system. And if you open it, you will see that all of these different sites, you can click on any of them. And so the one that I am talking about is here in House Street, and you can click on it and go to the, oh gosh, that's embarrassing. Okay, normally this would pop up with all of our sites, and so you can actually get the write-up, but you don't get the all the background analytical data. So we just did a new website on Friday, so I think they're just refreshing all the links. All right, other questions?
I had one. What's like the #1 thing that you would recommend to other states if they're trying to get a program like yours started?
I think if there was one thing that I could recommend, it would be setting up the collaboration structure. More than anything else, I think you've got, all the states have got, the individual pieces that Michigan has when it comes to, having the right agencies. You've all got those, but having that collaboration structure, so you've actually got the central authority that is, given by the governor. I think that has made a huge difference for Michigan. And we don't, let me just be clear, as my notes say here, MPART has 4 staff. We have 4 people that are actually full-time MPART PFAS dedicated. The rest of the staff are all part-time, working on their normal work duties plus PFAS. And so for Eagle, that's about 200 staff. For DHS, I think that's actually about 225. MDARD's got 25. Lara's got 2. MDOT's got probably, that should be like 10 or 15. ENR probably 5. So by the time you get done, we're probably at 4 full-time and probably 500 plus people that actually work on PFAS in some capacity, and participate in that collaboration effort. So it's a team effort. There's no way you can just assign 2 people for a state and say it's all going to get done. It's pretty intense.
Lee, do you want to ask that last question?
In a similar vein, did MPART try anything that didn't work well? I.e., were you able to eliminate some plans as ineffective?
I think some of the things that we had, some of the little things that we had going forward, we had this site in Kent County that had this one particular here. They had because the concentrations were coming back so high for drinking water, they gave everybody bottled water before they even sampled. They gave everybody bottled water, then sampled their houses and then came back. And it's now 4 years later, those people are still on bottled water. And so it's really hard to get people off of bottled water. So we had gone with the other projects, the rest of the state had kind of gone to giving filters. And so, I think while it wasn't ineffective, it wasn't sustainable to supply the whole state with bottled water versus giving filters. So we could give filters and help the local health departments set up a plumber to come out and install it in people's kitchens. That was sustainable, but doing the bottled water was one where, how do you take somebody off of bottled water once they've been on it? How do you tell them that, oh, we've sampled your well 3 or 4 times and it's not changing, so therefore you don't need bottled water anymore? That messaging gets really hard. And so just those little things tend to not be as much of a issue with ineffectiveness, but just the strategy behind doing the little things. You think you're being protective and you're easing people's minds, but in the long run, how do you make sure the end game of how you get them back off of those filters or back off of that bottled water is really important. So I think those were kind of some of our learning curves along the way, learning to not be afraid of what you're going to find, but prepare for what you're going to find, I think was our biggest challenge in just, taking our minds out of this true basics of science and research to effective communication with the public and effective long-term strategies for how you take that piece of data and then translate it into a policy of what's going to happen for the state.